Today we're going to make a conference table. I made this conference table for a really cool startup called YoShirt. I'm a creative advisor for them, and if you're interested in learning more, just click on the banner in the upper left. Here's what you need to get started. The top for the table is made out of a bunch of 2x6s with folding metal sawhorses for the legs, angle irons that I bought from Home Depot, a cordless drill, my 18-volt angle grinder, an orbital sander, and a circular saw. The sawhorses are great because not only will they be used as the legs, I can also use them as sawhorses as I'm building the table. I started by sanding all the 2x6s. They were 10 feet long, so this took a while. I then cut some strips of plywood to use as supports for the table. Now I wanted to recess the angle iron into the 2x6s, so I clamped them together using the pieces of plywood to help straighten them out, and then laid out the angle iron and marked a line along the edge of it with a pencil. I also marked where I would need to trim the angle iron so that it would sit flush with the edges of the table. I used my angle grinder with a cutting wheel to trim down the angle iron to the appropriate length. I then switched to a flap disc to grind down the edges smooth. Make sure that you clamp your work securely to the table before using an angle grinder. I was hoping that I could cut all the recesses at once, but the boards were a little too warped, so I had to cut them one at a time. I used the 2 scrap pieces of angle iron to adjust the blade height on my circular saw. I then clamped down a speed square and used my circular saw to cut a series of grooves into the edge of the board that would eventually make a recess for the angle iron. A little sanding with my orbital sander provided a really nice fit for the angle iron. I then laid out the hole pattern for drilling through the angle iron. Now ideally I should have used cutting oil when drilling through this much steel, but I didn't have any, so I just drilled through it anyways. I started with a smaller drill bit that was just big enough to let the screws go through. And then I switched to a larger bit so that I could countersink the screws so that it'd be more flush with the surface of the metal. Now I clamped the boards to the angle iron and screwed them to the angle iron one at a time. The first end of the table was pretty easy, but due to warping in the 2x6s, the second end was a little bit more challenging, so I had to kind of wrestle them into place. I actually used the pieces of plywood and some clamps to help force them into the right place. I then flipped the tabletop over and screwed on 3 pieces of plywood to act as supports. I then flipped the table back over and did a little bit of finish sanding. I spent a little bit of time rounding over the edges so that everything would be nice and smooth to the touch. So the screws were nicely recessed into the angle iron, but they weren't completely flush. So I decided to see if I could grind them down using the angle grinder. I really like how this edge detail came out for this table. The metal is nice and flush with the wood, and the screw heads are ground completely flush with the surface of the metal. I stained the tabletop with 1 coat of Danish oil. Now electricity is the lifeblood of a startup, well, that and Wi-Fi, so I wanted to try to wire this table up so that people working on laptops could plug in and recharge. I wrapped orange extension cords around the plywood so it would hide the plywood, and I held it into place using small metal hooks. Now I plugged all 4 extension cords into a single power strip, making it easy to provide power to the whole table. A quick power check to make sure I can charge my phone. Time to test out the table. The hooks keep the cords neatly tucked away from the table, but you can still unhook it and provide power anywhere on the table. Now one of the things I really like about these sawhorses is that you can adjust the height of them, so you could actually raise this whole table up to a standing height desk. For more detailed instructions, check out my website, and if you're interested in what I'm working on next, well, then just follow me on social media. If you're interested in getting the same tools that I use, check out Ryobi Nation. They have all sorts of cool giveaways.